Welcome to the latest Thomas Westcott podcast. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today. Today we are focusing on our charity sector. My name is Kat Williams and I'm the head of the Thomas Westcott Charity and Not-for-Profit team. I've been with Thomas Westcott for over 15 years. I'm ageing myself, and I'm based as a partner in our Barnstaple office. I work with many of our charity clients throughout the region, from the smaller charities through to our larger audited entities. Today I'm joined by Tom Stuckey, who I'll pass you over to briefly so he can introduce himself.
Thanks, Kat, and hello everyone. As Kat said, my name's Tom Stuckey. I'm a director here at Thomas Westcott, and I'm based in the Axminster office. I've actually worked for Thomas Westcott for over 12 years now, and I joined the firm originally as a trainee accountant. Like Kat, I have a wide portfolio of clients from across various business sectors, but have a particular interest in charities.
Thanks, Tom. In the charity podcast today, we're just going to discuss a couple of topical areas for charities, which both Tom and I, along with the wider Thomas Westcott team, have been discussing with our charity clients. Mainly, we're going to cover risk and risk management for charities. This is always incredibly important for our charity clients, as it is for any client. This is not only a regular discussion point amongst trustees, but it often comes back to us for our opinion and input. So just to start us off, Tom, in terms of risk management, what approach should trustees take when considering risk management?
Thanks, Kat. Firstly, I think it's key to understand risk management is an important consideration for trustees. It's crucial for safeguarding the funds of a charity and also the reputation of a charity. Charity trustees need to remember it's their responsibility to always act in the best interest of the charity, to manage the charity's resources responsibly, and also to act with reasonable care and skill. This would mean that where the trustee board doesn't have a particular skill set within it, they're wise enough to seek expert advice from a third party. The important thing for trustees to remember is that risk management is a dynamic process and will require regular review and revisiting. Risks are constantly changing over time, and some risks will become more of a priority to trustees than others at certain points, depending on external factors. Trustees can be assisted in the risk management process by using something we refer to as the risk management framework. This framework helps guide us in a 5-step process to manage risk effectively. The first of the 5 steps is identification, and this is where, as a board of trustees, you need to sit around a table and try and work out the various risks which your charity might face. It's often the most difficult one to work out as a board. The second step is to then measure the risk. So for each risk that you've identified, you must try and measure it. One way of doing this, one way of quantifying the risk, is to use something called a heat map, or it's also sometimes referred to as a risk matrix. This tool, which can be seen on page 16 of the Charity Commission document CC26, is really useful, and I'd recommend to any listener to have a quick look at the document. Basically, the tool will allow you to assign a figure determining the risk based on 2 factors. One, the probability or likelihood of the risk actually occurring, and also on the impact that the risk would have if it did occur to the charity. By using the score system on page 16 of this Charity Commission document, you'll be able to work out for each risk where it sits on this heat map and plan your response accordingly. The third step in the process is to manage the risk, and that will depend on the risk appetite of the trustee board. Generally, I would say most charities are risk adverse in nature, and where possible, try and reduce the risk to an acceptable level. There's 3 options really with managing risk. The first one is to tolerate it, because as a board you see it's within an acceptable level and it's perhaps fundamental to the primary purpose of the charity. The second option would be to try and treat or reduce the risk as much as possible so that it becomes an acceptable level. The third option would be to try and transfer the risk, either through an insurance policy or maybe outsourcing some of your non-primary activities to outside the charity to try and spread the risk. And the fourth option, which is the most drastic, would be to try and terminate the risk altogether if it's not essential to the charity's operations and the trustees deem it's too risky. The fourth step in the process is to monitor risk. By doing this, the trustees are ensuring that they are keeping check on the various risks that they've identified. The monitoring process should give responsibility to someone for monitoring it, explain how the risk is going to be monitored. It should also explain when the board's going to next review that risk and what that will entail. The final step in the 5-step process is to correctly report these risks. Now, first and foremost, an important document is your risk register, which you should maintain as a board of trustees, and that should include all these risks which you've identified, measured and managed. But you also need to consider other documents which you may publish as a charity for various different stakeholders, and those documents need to reflect the needs of the stakeholder. For example, employees, grant funders, and other external people who may be interested in your charity's accounts or other documents will need different information from you.
Thanks, Tom. I think it's often very easy for trustees just to focus on one particular area, quite often a particular area that they like, and miss other risks. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I think we can all be a little blinkered at times, and depending upon our background and our experience, we will probably have some things would be very obvious to us and we might be missing others. For that reason, it's really important and really useful for a board of trustees to have a diverse range of individuals making it up with perhaps different knowledge, skill sets, professional backgrounds or other experience. And then together, working together as this diverse board, they will be much more likely to identify all the risks that their charity is facing. Broadly speaking, the risks can be split into 5 main categories. So when you're trying to identify them, if you keep these 5 categories in the back of your mind, it will probably help you capture as many risks as possible. The first is governance risks. So, for example, does the charity have the right structure in place? Does the board have the right skills necessary to perform its charitable objects? Does the charity's governing document support the planned activity that the charity is undertaking? And perhaps, are there any conflicts of interest, in particular with trustees, that need to be managed or mitigated in some way? The second group of risks to consider are external risks, and these are often quite challenging because they're outside of the control of the Board of Trustees, but you do need to consider them. Things like, what would happen if government policy changes? What would happen if your public reputation was damaged in some way? Or what would happen if there were demographic factors that changed and had an impact on your charity going forwards? The third group of risks would be regulatory and compliance risks, and this would include things like health and safety legislation, GDPR, and also your responsibilities as an employer if the charity does indeed employ people. The fourth one to consider would be financial risk, and as accountants, this is the one that quite often sticks in our minds, but as trustees, you need to consider these things as well. So, for example, is the charity dependent on a limited number of income streams? And what would happen if one of those income streams reduced dramatically overnight? Could the charity cope? Does the charity have adequate reserves and adequate cash flow is another consideration. Does the charity have appropriate reserve policies in place? And does the charity have appropriate investment policies in place for any investments it might hold? The fifth and final group of risks to consider are the operational risks, and this would include things like staff retention and issues around health and safety and physical protection, security of assets such as charitable buildings, and it would also include maintaining the security of IT systems, which is very topical at the moment, particularly since COVID. A lot of charity staff have been working remotely from home, and it's really important to make sure your IT systems are up to scratch and secure and protecting the data you have. In terms of risks which charities face, one which we as accountants advise on regularly is the impact of changes to regulations on charities. The recent announcement of a new charities bill is one such area. What do you think the impact of a new legislation will be, Kat?
Good question. I think the first thing to say is when you hear the word new legislation, it does sound really scary and you start to think everything's going to change. Actually, the new Charities Act is more of a clarification, simplification bill rather than making any wholesale changes. It's a very hard bill to discuss on a more general basis, just because quite a few of the changes are quite niche. And whilst I think there'll be things in the new bill that impact for every charity, I don't think there's one area that will impact on every single charity. So I think it's definitely a way that the Charity Commission are looking at how we can streamline what charities do on a day-to-day basis, just to enable them to have a bit more freedom to make decisions, whilst not having to go back to the Charity Commission for every small thing. But obviously the Charity Commission is still staying there as the overarching body regulating the charity sector as a whole.
We both know that this new legislation is quite a wordy document, but for the purpose of today's podcast, what do you think the key points of the new legislation are?
Yes, Tom said it's a very long document. If anyone ever wants any bedtime reading, it's 26 pages of legal jargon. But the key points, which will be relevant for some charities, are they are making it slightly simpler to change your articles as a charity. At the moment, you just need to get Charity Commission approval for pretty much anything. If you're making smaller changes going forward, once the new legislation has been brought in, as a trustee board, depending on what your articles say, you may well be able to make these changes yourself without going back to the Charity Commission. This is one of the changes that requires a few additional systems and processes to be put in place. So in the initial timeline that the Charity Commission have come out with, this is one of the later changes, which I think at the moment they're saying probably autumn next year. The other changes are coming in over the next 18 months in batches. A couple of the other points that are included in the new charities bill is one I quite like to do with incorporations and mergers. There's always been a little bit of a worry where one charity's merged with another charity. If the charity that's in effect left behind is removed from the register, what happens to any legacies that are specifically left to that initial charity? The legislation does just clear that up and make it very clear that as long as the merger is on the Charity Commission list of mergers, then that should not be an issue anymore. So this should just get rid of the need for, in effect, shell charities to be left on the register, just on the off chance there's a donation or legacy in future years. One other smaller point, which I think will be more applicable for some of my smaller charities, although may also impact on some of the larger ones, is just a little bit more freedom around restricted funds when they've been received for a purpose and they're not able to be spent on that purpose. There are now a couple of circumstances where you can use it for another purpose as long as it's very similar to the initial purpose that the fund was given for even. This includes reasons such as if it's unreasonable to incur the cost to return the donation, or if you just can't find the donor. The maximum donation is £120, so it won't be applicable for everything, but is just a really nice small rule for where charities have got small pots of money that they're not able to use for the initial purpose. They can't find the funder, but that legislation will be there, which hopefully will enable charities to make full use of all their funds rather than having some cash stuck in the bank account because they can't get hold of the initial funder. As both Tom and I have mentioned, there is quite a lot in that change, but if you have any questions, I would just have a word with your local Thomas Westcott advisor, and we're more than happy to talk through all the changes, and we will be putting out blogs and updates as and when things are updated over the next 18 months or so. Just wanted to say thank you very much to Tom for being here today and for talking through the risks. Thank you everyone else for listening as well. If you do want any additional information, please get in touch with one of your local Thomas Westcott advisors or Tom or myself.
Thanks, Kat, and thank you everyone for listening.